If you get paid more frequently, you think that you're richer than what you are. So what's the result of that? What's the downstream consequences of that? Well, I have a little bit more money, I can spend more, right? So we have to remember that everything about our finances is wrapped up in people's perceptions and feelings. It's not a black and white conversation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Framework Podcast. I'm your host, Ana Trujillo Limón, and I am recording this episode in Orlando, Florida, which is normally very sunny, but it's actually raining today, and every day we're here. But it's sunny here in the expo hall because I get to chat with Dr. Wendy De La Rosa of the Wharton School of Business. Dr. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. You're too kind.
So I always I get such fun responses to this question. I like to ask about your journey. So what did you want to be when you were a little girl growing up? And how did you come to be Dr. Wendy De La Rosa?
Oh, man. I always loved science. I loved the scientific method. And so I knew at some level that I wanted to be a researcher. But more than that, if I'm being quite frank, I grew up in a very low income household. And so the number one thing is that I just knew I didn't want to be broke, right? I went to undergrad at Wharton. After that, I was a private equity investor at Goldman for a long time. And once I felt like I had accomplished and gotten over this fear, or if I don't do X, Y, Z, I'm going to end up where I grew up. It was a really debilitating period for me because I didn't know what I loved to do. And so, in fact, I have a lot of people to thank, especially some of my college professors who always sort of tapped me and said, "You have a really inquisitive mind. Why don't you try to study how humans make decisions?" And I kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off until, honestly, my desire just didn't allow me to put it off anymore. So I got to do that with Google, and then got my PhD at Stanford, and now found my way back to Wharton.
That's awesome. So your research focuses on using behavioral science to improve consumers' well-being. And before we hopped on stage and started recording this episode, we were talking about some things you've discussed before about, clients and consumers were just Davids facing a whole bunch of Goliaths, right? A whole bunch of marketing and people getting savvier at getting us to part ways with our money, right? I confessed my TikTok shopping obsession with you. But let's talk a little bit about that and how, advisors could kind of, what they need to know about that and how they can use that to help their clients make better decisions.
So I think the first thing is to recognize that finances are sort of our body twin at every stage of our lives, whether we're getting married or getting divorced or losing somebody we love or our kid going to college or starting daycare. All of these major decisions, all of these major life moments, all of these major transitions come tied fundamentally with a massive change in our financial situation. We can't escape it. It's that third person at the dining room table. And coupled with that is the fact that organizations, by and large, are getting way smarter, way better at helping us part with our money, right? You've all experienced it where you see, maybe an item that you want to buy one time on your desktop and it follows you through the internet like the stalker, right? You can't escape it. Well, it's easy to avoid the temptation of the donut one time. It becomes so much more incredibly difficult to avoid the temptation of the donut the 100th time you've seen it, or in the 100th variation, in the 100th color, right? And so I think we have to just have empathy with ourselves and recognize that the systems, right, are not necessarily set up for us to succeed. In fact, they're getting worse and worse and worse. And financial advisors, I think of them as sort of the last line of defense. Like, you are the last line of defense. Like, how many other organizations or people are really looking out for the financial well-being of consumers? There aren't many, right? And so when you put it into this context of, it's not a David versus Goliath story, it's a David versus millions of Goliaths. Now all of a sudden you can start to recognize the power and the influence that you all have as financial advisors to sort of help people create their environment, because it's almost an impossible journey to go through it alone without a financial coach or a financial advisor. The last thing I'll sort of mention is that we have to also recognize that there are nefarious Goliaths out there that are getting savvier. So, one of the most worrisome increasing trends for me is the massive rise in financial scams, including love scams. So, as our population has become more lonely, right, one of the biggest financial crimes that exists now is sort of getting people to fall in love with a fictitious person that's just there to extract funds. And it's, we often think about financial scams as things that happen to our parents or maybe our grandparents, but actually it crosses across all generations because we all want to feel seen, we all want to feel loved, we all want to feel important. And so, of course, we would do something for them. But the stories that I've heard have been completely devastating, where people lose their entire retirement accounts, and the financial shame that they feel as a result of that is really worrisome.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about financial shame. You talked about that in your presentation, and being victim to a financial scam is probably not something we're wanting to raise our hands like when you were asking us questions in there, and divulge that information. So let's talk about the role that financial shame plays in kind of in hindering financial wellness and how we could kind of address that.
Well, the first thing is, this is sort of what's unique about the world of finance, is that we want to hide it under the rug. We want to keep it taboo, because if someone punched you in the face, very few of us would be so ashamed to like, in fact, a lot of us would say, hey, look at what happened here. Go find this person. I just got punched in the face. And we don't think about financial scams in the same way because we have internalized the fact that our financial situations are solely a function of our own individual behaviors. And I think in a lot of ways, that might be problematic, because if it's only because of me, then any mistake that I make, it's only because of me. And it now turns into I am somebody who's not good with money versus I am just somebody who made a mistake. When we internalize that, we fall deeper and deeper into the hole. We ignore getting help. We're less likely to seek out help. We're also less likely to even talk about the issue in the first place, which makes the situation even worse, right? So I think as a first step, one of the best things that financial advisors can do is to hold somebody's hand and say, it's okay, right? Like, you're doing the right thing right now by starting the journey. And you may have started it a little too late, right? Maybe I met you a little too late, but that's okay. You're doing the right things now, right? People feel so much anxiety about just even talking about finances that it's just creating a disservice for all of us.
Yeah. So you had talked about a little bit about the, people know what they need to do. We know we should exercise every day, but do we? No, we know we shouldn't eat the donuts, but we do anyway. You talked about the changing the environment and changing the visuals to be able to help close that behavior gap. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think as financial advisors, you bear the responsibility of creating the environment between you and your client. And what does that environment look like? So, for example, if it takes a client three different steps, three different phone calls, three different forms to even start a conversation with you, well, the path of least resistance is going to be the most attractive, right? Everybody is busy. And on top of that, as we talk about all of these nefarious actors, right, they don't have friction. They're making every interaction as simple and as quick as possible. So we have to recognize that every form, every click, every page, every decision point is a potential barrier to behavior change. And once you recognize that and you think about, well, what is the behavior that I am hoping to influence as a fiduciary actor on behalf of my clients or on my clients, right? Then we have to be aggressive and ruthless in trying to design the most seamless process there. Maybe your client needs to rebalance their portfolio. Maybe they have too much of a concentrated stake in one company because they've been there for 20 years. Well, no one wakes up in the morning and let me tell you, like, I'm excited to rebalance my stock portfolio today. I've never once woke up thinking that.
I think you have. Come on. No, I'm just kidding.
I wake up and say, I'm excited to take my kid to the park, or And so it's your responsibility, right, to make sure that if the motivation isn't there, at least the path isn't difficult. And someone's motivation peaks when they're talking to you, when they're in your office, when they're on the phone with you. Once you let them leave, life happens. Work happens, children happen, spouse happens, aging parent happens. And so there you're going to see the motivation decline, right? So a lot of the times I talk to financial advisors where they give their clients a to-do list, a very well formatted, well thought out to-do list. And I just put my hands on my head and say, this is a recipe oftentimes for failure, because who's going to do that to-do list, right? Given all of the demands that we have on our time.
So it needs to be kind of like back in the day in school when you'd have time in class to do your homework, right? You have to do some things in the office.
I am a professor, so yes, bring back the homework in class. But
yeah, well, the path of least resistance, right? We always see those, like you're walking on campus somewhere and you see all of the carefully laid out cement sidewalks ready for us, but then the ones carved out in the grass that are shorter to get to so that makes sense. It's human nature, right? So you talked a little bit about an experiment you did with Digit that talked a little bit about savings rates and behaviors when it came to saving more. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that if they weren't here at Excel to experience it?
Yeah. So this is an experiment that we ran a couple of years back with a company called Digit. They're a fintech company that really focuses on helping people save. And so they take small amounts of money at random times from your checking account and transfer it over to the savings. Now, as a financial advisor, I want you to think about this example through the lens of increasing investment allocations. We know that there are certain times where people have a little bit more liquidity. They have a bump in their income, they have an increase in their income. Obviously, if you have a relationship with your client for a long time, you tend to know, right, when they get their annual bonus. You tend to know, right? It's not, at least when I worked at Goldman, it wasn't a surprise when bonus time was. Like everybody expects it for months and thinks about it for months. So in this experiment, we randomized their user base into two groups. In one condition, right, for the average American, one of the big paychecks that they receive is their tax refund. And we said, hey, Anna, you just got your tax refund. What percentage of it would you like to save? And it's all text-based, again, thinking about reducing all the barriers. So people could just text back a percentage from 0 to 100, and then Digit automatically move that money from their checking to their savings account. Now, in another condition, we texted people early in the tax season, hopefully before they even filed their taxes, and said, hey, Anna, you might get a federal tax refund. If you do, what percentage of it would you like to save? Now, this second question is much harder, right? I don't know if I'm going to get a tax refund. I don't know how much it's going to be, and yet you're asking me to pre-commit today for a savings percentage. Well, what we found was that when I texted you right when you received that tax refund, people on average wanted to save 17%. That's a pretty good savings rate given, what we know about the US. But when we texted people early in the tax season, they wanted to save on average 27%. And what did Digit do, right? When the tax refund hit, they then automatically saved 27% of it and moved that from the checking to the savings account. And you might be asking or thinking to yourself, well, sure, there's a bump initially, but what happens to long-term savings? We track savings over a 3-month period, and 85% of those savings were still in the account, right? And why is that? Well, it's because in the future, we tend to think about ourselves in terms of the best version of ourselves. Like, of course, future Wendy is going to be able to save over a quarter of my tax refund because expenses are going to be lower then, because I'm a better person then, because I call my mother more then, because I work out more then, right? And I'm not necessarily unique in that. We tend to think about our future selves in a lot of ways as the best versions of ourselves. And we often think about that as a negative, right? But we can use that as financial advisors and flip it on its head. So, can you be proactive with your clients and call them and say, hey, I think you're going to get a bonus in a couple of months. What's our plan for that? How much do we want to pre-allocate into, your retirement savings or into your investment portfolio or into your kids' 529 account? Let's create a plan right now for it. Because by the time the money hits, other people have already spent that money 3 times over, right? It's already been allocated for other things, right? So you have to get up front and help change that environment for people.
So you brought up bonuses there, and before we started recording, we were talking about some research that you're working on, some new exciting research. Let's talk about that, like the income fluctuations and all of that really cool stuff you're working on.
So there's some really amazing research being done by JP Morgan Chase and their foundation, where they found that 41% of American households experience more than a 30% volatility in their income from month to month. And we can all think about, I think when we think about income volatility, we tend to think about lower income earners. And of course, right, if you're a gig economy worker, your income might be volatile based on the number of hours that you work or the demand for your work. But it cuts across the income spectrum, right? So we talked about bonuses. That's a huge influx in your income that changes the income volatility, right? It sort of changes the trajectory of how you even think about your income. If we think about police officers who get overtime pay around the holidays, right? Their income tends to increase. If we think about teachers who are on a 9-month salary, and so their summer salary tends to decrease. It's this sort of insidious variable that we don't talk about. And so what happens is when we think about our income as volatile, we tend to then think that our resources are less than what we actually have. So we have 2 people, they both earn $5,000 every month. The one who earns $5,000 on a more volatile basis throughout the month tends to think about the fact that they've earned less money. And in the lab, when we've gotten people in the lab, we've asked them, on average, how much money did you earn? After they've seen every single paycheck, and they systematically have lower estimates of their income. Well, what are the downstream consequences of that? Well, if I think I have a lower income, then how can I ever afford to save? I don't have any money. How can I ever afford to invest, right? I don't have any money. So when we perceive our wealth as lower than what it actually is, it has all of these downstream consequences. Now, on the flip side of this, one of the things that we found is that there's this huge trend of paying people more frequently, right? So, for example, your Uber drivers can now get paid 5 times a day, right? They don't have to wait a week to get paid. The more frequently you get paid, all else equal, you earn $5,000, you earn $5,000. If you get paid more frequently, you think that you're richer than what you are. So what's the result of that? What's the downstream consequences of that? Well, I have a little bit more money, I can spend more, right? So we have to remember that everything about our finances is wrapped up in people's perceptions and feelings. It's not a black and white conversation.
So what are some proactive ways, proactive implications of this research for financial advisors, checking to see if their clients have this volatile income or if they get paid more frequently? What are some proactive ways they can implement this in their practice?
Yeah, so there's 2 things that I think financial advisors can do. All of you, I assume, walk with your clients through their financial plan. And we typically tend to think about it on a monthly basis, right? Okay, this is what your monthly expenses tend to be. But that ignores the reality of a lot of people, because guess what? People's expenses aren't the same every month, right? When I have to pay my kids' school, that typically comes in a large lump sum at the beginning of the year. Or when I have to pay my property taxes, or when I have to pay my auto insurance, right? And so, but we force the simplification in terms of these monthly budgets because it's easier for us to talk about, right? And I think as a financial advisor, we have to then remember, let's help plan for the large income shocks or low income shocks, and let's help plan for the large income like expense shocks as well, right? Once we have that conversation, now all of a sudden it's not just about increasing information. Here's a budget, here's a plan. No, I'm helping you pre-commit. I'm helping you change your behavior. I'm helping you put a plan into action.
So let's talk a little bit about trends in behavioral economics research that you're noticing or that you're really excited about or that kind of get you geeked up.
Oh my gosh, I get geeked out over so much. Well, I think what we talked about, sort of this recognition that $100 does not equal $100, right? That $100 being paid out monthly is different than $100 being paid out weekly, and vice versa. So I think that's a huge trend right now that I'm really excited about because, again, it has all of these downstream consequences in terms of people's likelihood of investing, risk seeking, etc. The other piece that I'm excited about is that we are now starting to think about people's feelings about their finances. So I'll give you an example. Some research has shown out of both like the University of Pennsylvania and others that just experiencing income volatility has negative consequences on your health. You report more stress. Okay, that's not surprising. But you're also more likely to have a cardiac event. Your sleep quality decreases. And there's some correlational evidence on mortality, right? And so I think the biggest thing that I'm just excited about in the field of behavioral science is that we are recognizing that people's finances drive almost every aspect of their well-being. Your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your relationship well-being. And it sort of helps us think about the importance of all of your job, right? Like if you're an antecedent, if you're driving people's mental, physical, and social well-being, then you can recognize how important your job is, right? The last thing that I will say that I'm just like so excited by is that there's some new research by amazing PhD students thinking about how do we reduce financial shame and how do we reduce financial stigma, right? Just saying you shouldn't feel financial shame.
Shaming.
It's like, okay, great.
Do that.
Don't do that. Don't feel this way, right? It's like no effect, right? You're almost highlighting the fact that I do feel financial shame. And so there's a couple of interventions that have, and it turns out that even just saying to people, look, millions of people like you are going through the same thing is also not effective. And so we haven't yet pinpointed down what does move the needle. But I think a lot of the things that some of us would think about that would move the needle are sort of are proving to be ineffective. And I'm excited that at least through the scientific method, we're crossing out some of the things that don't work.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're in the beginning stages of having some really cool tools, but what are some existing tools that advisors can use for this type of work in there to find these types of biases or things that are going on with clients? What are some tools you recommend for them?
So I think the first tool is to employ what I call a 3B framework. So the first B is what is the behavior that you're trying to influence? Like be very clear about that, right? And some people say to me, well, I want to improve my client's financial well-being. Well, that's not a behavior. I can't measure it. I can't pinpoint it. Like when, where, how, at what time is your client going to enact this, right? So being very specific about what is the behavior that you're trying to influence and you're trying to drive, obviously in their fiduciary interests. Then think about the benefits. So something that's happening in the future is actually not a benefit, right? Like a lot of the times, all of our dashboards say, well, here's how much money you're going to have in retirement, and here's how much money you're going to have when you're 75, and you're talking to a 45-year-old. Well, you know what? Like, that's great, but it's not really motivating. You have to think about what is motivating for that client right now, right? Is it you're being a better parent right now because you're putting away money for your kids' education, or you're being a better spouse right now because you're finally setting up that trust. Because if something were ever to happen to you, you know that your spouse is set up, right? Like things that are motivating to people here in the now are way more important. And then going back to our earlier conversation, the last B is reducing all of the barriers and being ruthless about what I mean by a barrier. And that means every phone call, every click, every step, every screen, right? If you go through and it takes 7 screens for someone to just make an appointment with you, that's way too much, right? Like, how can you simplify that so you can improve your own practice, right? Because one of the things that we discussed earlier today, we are at a crossroads. Trust in financial institutions, trust in general, has just been plummeting over the last decade. And the financial services industry has really been impacted by this lack of trust. And the only way that we can gain trust is not through words, but it's through actions, right? So that's the responsibility that you all have, and I guess the opportunity that I'm really excited by.
So in your presentation, speaking of the trust barrier, there is some silver lining though, right? The Gen Z generation, kind of similar to the boomers in a lot of ways, being raised by the silent generation who went through the Great Depression and everything. So they have a little bit more trust in financial services. And you mentioned some other trends among Gen Z. Let's talk a little bit about that as we start to wrap up.
Well, I will say, so Gen Z, based on the research, seems to be more similar to the silent generation, in that as they were growing up, they saw their parents really struggle through the 2008 recession. And as they were entering the workforce, a lot of them were in the middle of the pandemic. And if they had already been in the workforce, they were some of the first ones to be put on furlough or laid off. What is the result of all that? Well, when we look at their savings behavior, they're the ones who are saving the most compared to any other generation at their age. They're the ones who are thinking about their financial future. Now, they don't have a great outlook on their financial future, but as a result of that, they're creating a cushion to try to protect themselves from that. They're also very focused on their values, just like the silent generation. Now, the values are different, but they try to live out their financial decisions in line with their values. And then I think the third thing is that they're extremely pragmatic in a way that the millennials have not been, right? So I'll give you some quick examples. Gen Zers are the generation that is least likely to engage in underage drinking. They're the least likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors. They're the least likely to engage in risky driving. They're extremely pragmatic in terms of both their career choices and their lifestyle choices. And so all of these things give me hope for the future. And they also have the most trust in financial institutions. They're the first digital native generation. And so all of the tools that you get set up in your practice, they're going to be the ones that are most likely to enable them for themselves because they've just been living in a digital world for a long time, right? Now, with that said, they have a lot of different challenges than some of the other clients. Just like millennials, they're going to be facing, right, this challenge of how do I deal with student loans? How do I think about paying off my student loans as I'm thinking about home ownership, which is becoming increasingly out of reach for the average young person? So they're going to have slightly different challenges, but they're much more pragmatic than their earlier generations are.
Yeah, so let's dive into a little bit of those generational differences and what advisors should kind of know the way the different generations engage with them. What are some things you want advisors to know about the different generations and how can they implement that?
So thinking about Gen Z is what, and again, this is a broad generalization, but just looking at the data, they're an anxious generation. So when we think about anxiety and fears for the future, right, they have a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. And when you couple with that, on top of that, sort of how likely I am to talk about my financial situation, where that just breeds even more anxiety, right? And so being essentially empathetic to that generation is extremely important, because if you're talking to an anxious person, right, their likelihood of retreating and stepping back increases, right, if you're not sort of empathetic. And that's different, right, from a lot of other generations. I think one of the things that we're all going to have to face and figure out, and I don't know what the answer to that is sort of this democratization of access to the financial markets, and how people think about Bitcoin, how people think about NFTs, right? Like that, those are investment tools that just didn't exist before. And this generation is being bombarded all of the time on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat by all of these financial advisors. And I'm going to put this in air quotes to say, you want to get rich quick today? Come follow my stock trades, right? And they don't have any fiduciary responsibility. We don't hear about all of the negative implications of all of that, including young children who have been given access to investing on margin, right? And again, all of the negative implications of that. So I think that's something that we're going to have to reckon with in a way that we've never reckoned with before. And I don't know what the answer is. But again, I do know that you all are the first line of defense, right? You all are the ones talking with that person. You're all the ones talking with the parents who ultimately sometimes have to step up and fill that gap. So you tell me in a couple of years how you all figured out, but it's something that we're going to have to reckon with.
Yeah, for sure. So as we start to wrap up, is there any final pieces of advice or words of wisdom that you want to share that I wouldn't know to ask, that you want our advisors and planners to know?
Well, I think the thing that I hope to leave everybody with is that time is our most valuable resource. And so I'll tell this to you all, but also hopefully so that you tell this to your clients, to say, love yourself enough to prioritize you by taking a financial health day. When you're sick, you take a sick day, you schedule your annual appointment. When you need a vacation, you schedule those vacation days. This is not the problems that we're facing are fundamentally not information problems, right? People understand that they need to be invested in the market. People understand that they need to diversify their portfolio, but the how and the when right now is never the right time. And so help your clients create the time, right? When they're with you and say, okay, let's schedule your financial health day. We have a lot to do. We have to set up your trust. There's a lot to be done here. Let me hold your hand and do it with you. But the only way that we can do it is through a financial health day.
So let's talk a little bit about what the structure of a financial health day looks like, because that sounds so interesting.
Well, the first thing I would say is just cap it at 3 actions. More than that is too much, right? Like we all get overwhelmed. And let your client decide what they think is the most important thing for them, right? So maybe for somebody is finally figuring out where all my long lost retirement accounts are and what my username and passwords are going to be for that. And figuring out, who in HR I have to call because I no longer have access to that email account that I had for that job back in 1992, right? All of these things take time, and we have to recognize that they take time. So maybe that's that. Maybe it's setting up the trust. And so how do I even go about that? Well, I need to find my right lawyer. I need to find the right person to shepherd me through that. Help them walk through and identify the top 3 things that they can do during that time. And then let's be efficient with that time, right?
Okay. No.
And then the last thing is, anytime we do effort, we want to get a reward. So also schedule in a reward for yourself. You just did a lot of hard work. So what is that reward going to be? Maybe it's an outing with your kids. Maybe it's, okay, well then I get to buy the pair of shoes that's been following me around on Instagram for so long that I'm trying to avoid, whatever it is. But we also have to reward effort, right? Talking about finances can't always be gloom and doom. It's, we're planting oaks.
You have to wait, right, till you achieve the action to get the reward. That's where my problem is. Like, I'm gonna just treat myself. So you brought up something there that sparked a question I remembered I wanted to ask, which is that the average tenure at a job is just over 4 years. And so there are a lot of accounts out there that people might be, missing. And neglecting. Let's talk a little bit about the implications of that, 4-year number in jobs that has on people's financial well-being.
Yes. So this also varies by generations, right? So the median time at a job now, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is 4.1 years. That's much less for Gen Z. And so when we think about that, that means that every 4 years, someone is going through the hard, painstaking process of trying to sign up for a new 401k and all of the pitfalls that comes with that. That means that every 4 years, they now get the default path of saying, hey, you've left our firm. Do you want to just cash out your 401k? Because that tends to be the default. It's not an automatic rollover, which I don't know why an automatic rollover is not the baseline, but it's not, right? And so we have to recognize that that's just the median. For Gen Z, it's much faster. And they are also more likely to enter industries that don't have traditional financial benefits attached to it, right? You don't have financial security or for access to a 401k as an influencer, as an example, or as an independent contractor. You just don't have that. So it becomes a lot harder for people both to start, and then when they leave, all of the default paths are essentially not set up for us to succeed, right? So I think this is where, again, you as financial advisors are so critical. Because if you have a client that you've been working on for a long time and they're telling you they're planning on switching jobs, then help them prepare. All right, great. So what's our plan for our benefit sign up? Let's walk through that together. Or, right, I'm switching jobs. Okay, great. Now what's your plan for rollover? Do you want to roll over that accounts to us so that way you don't have to worry about it? Like, that's the type of proactive conversation that needs to be had in order to overcome all of these structural barriers that are just not set up for us to succeed.
So, what is one thing you wish the industry advisors, planners would reframe their thinking about when it comes to behavioral finance?
I wish that we would expand beyond the opt-in, opt-out. I think when people think about behavioral finance, they think about all of the great work by Eric Johnson and others, sort of showing, and Dick Thaler, for example, showing just the benefits of having an automatic roll in into 401ks or whatever the case is. I think that's just a starting point, right? And that's an example of being ruthless about all of the barriers that are stopping someone from investing or increasing their allocations or re-diversifying their portfolio. If we become as ruthless as that in other parts of behavioral in other parts of your life, right, in other parts of your client interactions, I think we'll be well on our way. But I think I just wish that we would expand beyond that.
Love it. Well, Dr. Wendy, this has been so lovely to spend some time with you today. Thank you so much for making time and joining us here on Framework.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And everybody else, thank you for joining us on this episode of Framework. I hope you subscribe so you don't miss another one.